So, does anyone care to touch on this further?
And lots of them are written broadly with policy pronouncements and expressions of policy priorities, etc., as a PR way, if you will, of publicizing what the White House is doing and how the president and his team want to approach particular issues.
In other words, what you get to see presented as what the executive order says is just the face of it. It's the whitewashed version, the polished version. My name is Jerry. I left MAGA and I'm working on this project here of these Project 2025 training videos. And I think it's time I change my strategy a little bit, starting here with number 7 in this series. The link for this has always been in the description on this series. But I figured when I peeked in a while ago and saw that in the last week it's ticked up from 53% or 52% to 53%, that I need to address this directly before we actually get into the the training video that I'm covering in this episode. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time looking through this. You can pause as you want so you can see what the progress is, or you can go and click the link in the description and you can go and take a look for yourself. It's all right out there in the open. It's all available. So there's all that there at 53%. And here's my sense of urgency. Time until end of term. 1,023 days, 19 hours, 19 minutes, and 543. Anyway, you can see the ticker there. Oh, it's annoying as all get out. Yes, I'm feeling frustrated because of this number right here. It keeps climbing up. So before we move into this particular training video, I want to just share with everybody this quote from Sun Tzu. Therefore, I say, know the enemy and know yourself. And under battles, you will never be in peril. When you are ignorant of the enemy, but know yourself, your chances of winning or losing are equal. If you are ignorant of both your enemy and of yourself, you are certainly certain in every battle to be in peril. And in this particular context, in this particular usage, I want to replace the name or that word enemy with opposition. If you are ignorant, if ignorant of both your opposition and of yourself, you're certain to lose every time. And it's hard to push back against authoritarianism if you don't understand how it works, how it's built. So, um, yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the patriarchy. All right, let's get that clear. What do we got here? We got executive orders. Oh, these people love their executive orders. All right, let's do this. Leaving the title slides in place to give ProPublica their due privilege, due rights, and Heritage Foundation. You should have responded.
Well, hello, I'm Steve Bradbury, Distinguished Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and I'm here to talk about executive orders and related presidential action documents. I served in the Trump administration in the Department of Transportation as the General Counsel and Acting Deputy Secretary, and I was responsible for carrying out requirements of presidential executive orders. During the
All right, let's see about speeding this guy up.
Bush administration, I served at the Department of Justice, heading up the Office of Legal Counsel, where I was responsible for reviewing and approving the legality of presidential executive orders.
Oh, dude's got a right set of credentials there, doesn't he? He worked in the transportation department as counsel during Trump 1, and he also has ties to the Justice Department under Bush 2. Interesting. All right, let's get on with this. Executive orders, drafting and implementation.
So any discussion of executive orders needs to start with the president's duties and responsibilities under the Constitution. And so we need to focus a little bit on what those are. So the president is the chief executive officer for the federal government. And in that role, he's responsible for ensuring that the laws are correctly carried out. He also is responsible for supervising all of the subordinate officers within the executive branch who are given authorities by Congress through statutes to run departments and agencies, for example. The president is responsible for managing the workforce of the executive branch, ensuring that its responsibilities are carried out properly and efficiently.
No, 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 no. That's the Office of Personnel Management. That's the OPM. That's not the president himself. He's got people for that.
The president also is the primary officer responsible for the national defense of the United States and for our foreign policy.
Okay, that's the commander in chief fallacy there. Yeah, he might be the commander in chief, but he's not. He's not a freaking dictator over the military. Anyway.
The president has some other duties under the Constitution, specific duties like the responsibility to ask for opinions from different officers within the executive branch and propose legislation to Congress. And then the president may also be given statutory authorities of his own by Congress or under treaties that have been ratified by Congress. So the purpose of executive orders is a primary means by which the president exercises these authorities that he has under Article 2 of the Constitution or under statutes or treaties. The president is a creature created by the Constitution, not by statute.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh, good grief. That was a lot to unpack there. This guy needs a genuine civics lesson.
The president is a creature created by the Constitution, not by statute. So the president is not an agency of the federal government. President does not.
Excuse me. It's one of the three branches in there of the federal government, and therefore inherently is an agency of the government. Oh my goodness.
Issue regulations such as an agency would do, and is not subject to the Administrative Procedure Act, which covers.
Okay, maybe I should have held my tongue for a few seconds more because he added that nuanced caveat in there. But a lot of folks on that side don't hear the rest of that. Of course, a lot of the folks on that side want to rewrite the Constitution while also calling themselves constitutional conservatives. Yeah, the hypocrisy is endless.
Covers agencies and their rulemaking functions. And the president's senior assistants and advisors within the White House, also the White House does not constitute an agency, does not issue regulations. So the question is, how does the president carry out his functions?
Ex- um, and yet he writes an executive order to deregulate industries. Like he wrote an executive order to deregulate glyphosate for crying out loud.
And the way he does it is through orders. He gives orders, directions to his subordinates. He sets the policy directions for his administration, tells them what the priorities are. And he does this through a variety of instruments. The primary one is the executive order. So the function and purpose of an executive order really tracks the president's authorities, duties under the Constitution and statutes. So the president may use an executive order, for example, to express his view on the proper interpretation of federal statutes.
No, that's the Supreme Court's job. That's the job of the judiciary.
The correct policies to pursue where those statutes give the executive branch some discretion, some policy-making flexibility. The president can identify which policies and directions he wants his administration to follow and give directions for doing that.
That can all be handled with internal memos and email chains, not weaponized executive orders.
The president can use executive orders to supervise the functions of subordinate executive officers who are acting pursuant to statutory authorities.
That's not the president's job to micromanage everything. He's got people for that.
So the head of a department or agency is given important substantive statutory authorities by Congress that they have the responsibility of carrying out faithfully, but the president can supervise them in how he wishes to see them carry out those authorities. It's important to realize the president himself cannot actually carry out those authorities because Congress has granted them, delegated them to the head of a department or agency created by statute. So the president is not superseding the authority of that subordinate officer, but is giving directions and supervising how he wants to see that authority carried.
Wait, well, let's run back through that again. That felt like some mental parkour.
Or agency created by statute. So the president is not cannot actually carry out those authorities because Congress has granted them, delegated them to the head of a department or agency created by statute. So the president is not superseding the authority of that subordinate officer, but is giving directions and supervising how he wants to see that authority carried out. A very important
Okay, he's not interfering, but he's interfering.
distinction. The president also has wide authority to set performance standards and manage the performance of the workforce within the executive branch and can do that by executive order as well.
Hold up, hold up, hold up. No, 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 no. In episode 6 of this series, where they were talking about background checks and security clearances, this is all stuff that's already been pre-established. And and this guy just said that various agencies are established by statutory mandate of Congress, and yet somehow, good grief.
Some executive orders relate to his foreign policy and national security functions. He can give orders to the military, orders for national security purposes, require that officers within the executive branch act in certain ways, in certain arrangements that
Like Marco Rubio and his ill-fitted shoes.
he thinks are important to advance national security and other functions to help inform him on carrying out his presidential duties. Important to realize some critical limitations on.
So yeah, that actually fits into the whole cult of one thing. This whole, I mean, okay, so in background checks and security clearances, they were talking about these very detailed confessor type federal forms that a prospective hire would fill out, an applicant would fill out. And yeah, the way this cat is describing executive orders, it's more like mandates coming down from a mob boss, which I mean, Roy Cohn. Moving on. Uh, I know he wasn't a mob boss, but he was a mob lawyer, and he was mentor to Donald Trump and Roger Stone. We'll come back around to that guy. If you don't know about him, we got some stuff to talk about, folks. Anyway, um, back to this guy and him trying to educate people that executive orders are mob boss directions.
Executive orders or really any other presidential action document. The president does not have authority to make the law. That's what Congress does, the legislative branch, under our Constitution. And the president does not have authority to appropriate money, create budgets for the executive branch to spend money on different things. Again, that's a function of Congress. Congress makes appropriations of money, creates budgets for agencies. So
Introduce Doge.
an executive order must be consistent with statutory requirements, cannot violate statutes, cannot supersede statutory requirements, and must be carried out consistent with existing budgetary appropriations. The president can't create new budget authority. Also, of course, fundamentally, they have to be consistent with the Constitution. They have to flow from some legitimate exercise of the president's own authority. So it's important to realize. They can affect private rights, as I'll talk about further. And if they do affect private rights or individuals or companies who believe they are negatively affected by some action taken under a presidential executive order, they may be subject to challenge in court. And
Didn't Donald Trump sign off a executive order introducing that Gateway project, funneling a whole bunch of money into AI, a whole bunch of our taxpayer dollars into AI? Palantir, Peter Thiel. Yeah.
of course, Congress may respond to an executive order in different ways. Congress may like the president's arrangements that he's created under executive order, and they might ratify them by statute and actually make them permanent through a new agency type structure that reflects what the president has put in place under an executive order. And Congress may also enact a budget for that activity to take place. And so in that way, actions that presidents take, directions they give under executive orders, can sometimes develop into permanent structures, frameworks within the executive branch for how the executive branch is going to take action. And those frameworks may be supported by statutory laws, laws passed by Congress, budgets that are granted by Congress.
So executive order drafting and implementation. Executive orders are a primary means by which the president exercises the authorities he has under Article 2 of the Constitution under statutes or treaties. Critical limitations of executive orders. Executive orders must be consistent with the law, not repugnant to the Constitution. How about that? How about that being the law of the land? And the president does not have the authority to appropriate money or create budgets for executive branch spending. No, but what have we seen maneuvered? Uh, cuts to what? The VA, and where else? Attempted cuts at Medicare, um, and that tariff thing. That doesn't even matter here. But where where has the money been spent to carry out some of these executive orders, or some of these orders from the executive branch, like for ICE? Who's hosting their web servers? I mean, I buy a lot of stuff from Amazon. It's convenient. That's where they get you. But if I boycotted everything that was tied to all of this, I wouldn't be able to have access to anything. So I have minimized my interaction with Amazon, but there's just some things I can get there that I can't find anywhere in all of St. Louis. So there's that. But anyway, uh, with Doge having gone through and done a bunch of hacking and slashing, that allegedly opened up funds, and that's a whole another ball game. Uh, but yeah, no, the president doesn't have the authority to appropriate money. But as this cat said a few minutes ago, uh, an executive order could be written to tell somebody else to do it. That very mob-like structure. All right, it's gonna take me forever to get through this one. Just saying.
So what is the format and structure of a typical executive order? It's a fairly formal document. They tend to track the same general format, and that's usually enforced by the Justice Department and by the Office of the Federal Register. They usually start out with just a statement of authority. It's the president's constitutional authority and maybe some specific statutes sometimes referenced. They usually then start out with a first section, which is a policy statement. This is the president's statement of a policy for his administration, the reason for the executive order, the direction he wishes his administration to take on a particular issue. They may then include definitions of relevant terms that need to be defined for purposes of understanding the directions in the executive order. And then usually they'll have a series of directives, in the usual case, given to principal officers within the president's administration. These are typically cabinet officers, heads of departments that report directly to the president. These are senior officers of the executive branch appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the.
All right, just stop. All right, so back during the first Trump administration, Donnie Boy himself said that he would handle the bump stock issue. All right. So how did he handle it? He wrote an executive order that gave the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives the the power to define or redefine on a whim the phrase machine gun for the purpose of giving them ultimate authority on bump stocks and trigger blocks and so on and so forth. So yeah, that was a direct assault on the Second Amendment, but that came down through the ATF on an executive order from Donnie Trump in his first term. All right, so let's get back to this guy.
The Senate, and the president, through the executive order, is typically giving them directions for how to advance the policy that's expressed in the executive order. Usually these requirements can include things like create certain arrangements or structures for decision making or review of issues. So the president may create a task force, may require interagency action among different departments for consultation on issues, reviewing issues, making proposals, recommendations. Oftentimes, the director of the Office of Management and Budget is then tagged with responsibility to follow up and make sure that the departments and agencies carry out those requirements and report back to the president with any recommendations, formulating reports, etc. And executive orders will typically include some boilerplate language saying that they don't create rights for any person that are enforceable against the government. And it is usually the case that the issuance of the executive order itself is not subject to court review or approval.
And so that's how we got the FBI pulling people off of trafficking investigations and put on ICE watch. And seriously, there's FBI agents out there that have been pulled off of human trafficking investigations and drug trafficking investigations for the purpose of sitting in a parking lot and watching for illegal immigrants so they can call ICE and have them deported. All right, you can pause that if you want to read it. Let's move on.
It has come to be established and initially created by President Kennedy for the development, approval of executive orders, and that's typically followed. Again, they're fairly formal documents. So initially, there's a proposal for an executive order that someone within the president's administration or the president himself will come up with. Sometimes that's from the top down. The president himself or the very senior advisors to the president may have an idea for a policy that needs to be advanced, something that needs to be changed in the way the executive branch is carrying out its functions and duties, and they may propose an executive order. Conversely, it may be bottom up. It may be an idea for an executive order that percolates up from a department or agency that has an interest in that subject matter and has identified a need for presidential direction.
Enter preacher Doug Wilson. You know, that cat that hosted that big prayer, well, not hosted, but led that big prayer breakfast thingy at Pete Hegseth's prayer breakfast over there at the Pentagon. Yeah. This is where that comes in.
Or a desire for advancing presidential policy and effectiveness through an executive order. So the executive order idea will be proposed and discussed among the interested different policy advisors or department heads, and then it will be assigned to the director of the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, to coordinate the development of the text for the executive order, the ideas and then ultimately the text. Somebody is charged with drafting the first draft. It may be somebody on the president's domestic policy or foreign policy team at the White House. It may be
Well, if it's a foreign policy team, that'd be Mr. Marco Rubio, right? Allegedly, Mr. Who suffered enough cuts in his budget because of Doge that they shut down, the State Department shut down their International Human Trafficking Office. Yeah, yeah, fun stuff.
an agency or department under the supervision of the secretary who prepares an initial draft. Then the director of the Office of Management and Budget will circulate that draft to all departments, agencies, and offices that may have an interest in the issue. And it goes through multiple drafts. It gets reviewed and approved by the director of the Office of Management and Budget. Also, one of his subordinates, the director of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, and the general counsel within OMB. At that point, it will then go over to the Justice Department. And the Attorney General has assigned to the Office of Legal Counsel, which is headed up by an Assistant Attorney General, the responsibility for reviewing draft executive orders for form and legality. So OLC, as it's called, will go through a process of vetting the executive order, reviewing all the relevant statutes, researching the law, making sure that the executive order could be carried out consistent with the law, that it is within the president's authority, that it doesn't require any additional legal action, and that it is formatted correctly and correctly expressed or articulated consistent with the existing legal framework so that it will be effective. And
In other words, double check your chat GPT written executive order. Make sure that all the untoward prompts that give it away as AI written are removed, and make sure that anything and everything that is referenced within that post is also a legitimate resource to link to. Let's see, who was it that did that? Wasn't it Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the whole Maha thing with those fake reports and that? Anyway, yeah, edit your stuff, proofread it.
and there's a back and forth usually and some revisions made, and then OLC will issue a short memo confirming that they've concluded the final version is consistent with the law, it is approved for form and legality. At that point, it will go, OLC will share it with the Office of the Federal Register. Federal Register will review it for formatting, typographical errors, etc., so that it'll be ready for publication in the Federal Register. It then goes to the staff secretary at the White House. The staff secretary then circulates it to all the senior advisors within the White House, domestic policy, foreign affairs, etc., whoever may be relevant to the issues, and they get a final review and approval. So, of course, changes can be made at in the final stages, because it's only at that point, typically, that the most senior advisors to the president are seeing the final version of a proposed executive order. And so it may have to be shared again. New directions may be given. People may have to go back to the drawing board. So it's a process, a fairly formal process. At that point, the staff secretary will take the final approved version and present it to the president with any relevant materials the president needs to review for the president's consideration and potential signature. Usually at that point, the president knows it's been coming, has been part of the discussions, may have even originated the idea or at least discussed it. And then
Really? Um, I don't remember that being a thing with Trump. Hasn't he always had somebody standing there next to him when he's getting ready to sign these things, and this person's like, "Oh, this is executive order number whatever," and it does blah blah blah. It's not. Oh, good grief!
um, under established process and according to law, all executive orders are published in the Federal Register. So they're available for the public to see, but they can become effective immediately.
So that prompts me with the question: Is Donald Trump just the Republican version of the auto pen? I'd asking for a friend, trying to figure it out. Again, you can pause for that if you want to.
These are transparent documents by which the president is expressing his policy desires and giving directions to subordinates within the executive branch. And often presidents like to use executive orders as ways of publicizing their policy priorities and the way they like to think about issues and the solutions they are pursuing on particular issues. So quite frequently, an executive order is something of a PR document. Now, you can see if you go on the White House website, there's a tab for presidential actions, and it's all of the publicly available actions the president has taken, and it includes all the executive orders the president has signed. And lots of them are written broadly with policy pronouncements and expressions of policy priorities, et cetera, as a PR way, if you will, of publicizing what the White House is doing and how the president and his team want to approach particular issues.
In other words, what you get to see presented as what the executive order says is just the face of it. It's the whitewashed version, the polished version of whatever it is they're doing. Because as it's being developed, the original intent of the executive order is more plainly understood, and then it's refined for public relations as it moves on down the line. And then is finally presented to the president, who you hope has been part of the conversation. I seriously doubt he's been part of very many conversations lately. Anyway,
There are different effects that executive orders have and different ways they're used. I've just described how they can be a PR document and really sort of encapsulate pronouncements about the president's priorities. And so that's
oh, and on that note, if you haven't checked out the playlist that I offered up in the comment section or in the post section on my channel, here on YouTube, go check out the Century of Self. Or because then that way you'll understand the life and work of Edward Bernays and how it's played out over the past century or so. But it will also give you a point of reference in the bigger story as I start bringing in clips from that and along with some of this other stuff that I'm working on, public relations and how to unspin it.
why you see sometimes in the opening days of a new administration something of a flurry of executive orders. When the president wants to set a tone, change direction from the previous administration, some of these executive orders will include revocations of the previous president's executive orders. President Biden, the current president, has been extremely active in doing that kind of thing. So if you go on the website I talked about, you'll see all the executive orders listed in reverse chronological order. You go back to the beginning and you can see all the early ones that he issued trying to set a new tone different from the Trump administration. Some of them are very
And by many people on the Trump side, that was interpreted as a spiritual attack from the Antichrist.
long speaking pieces, really PR pieces. A lot of them aren't really doing anything. They're expressing sort of his take, his view, his emphasis on things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, big executive order on that, and climate change, very long.
A couple of their boogeymen that they make a big deal of on the DEI. It's a monstrosity, and climate change is a hoax, kind of like the Epstein files, in their eyes anyway.
Long 23-page executive order touching on environmental justice, all kinds of climate issues. And a lot of these will give directions to agency heads in different departments and agencies to form task forces and to come up with ways of advancing these policies, always consistent with their existing statutory authorities. Again, the president can't create new legal authorities, but he can direct departments and agencies heads to exercise their existing authorities in the way he would like to see them exercised. So some executive orders are really mostly policy pronouncements or PR. But others can be very important for creating enduring frameworks for taking action within the executive branch. And so there's some executive orders which may be very temporary or impermanent because they really reflect the current president's policy emphasis and priorities. And the following president may revoke all of those executive orders on day one. An executive order can be fully revoked by a subsequent president. No president can bind a following president with an executive order. On the other hand, there are a lot.
In other words, canceling the previous president's executive order with an executive order of your own is really no more than a pissing contest.
Good examples of important executive orders that create structures that are very useful and that persist and carry on from administration to administration.
Like mass deportation. That's going to be a big one to untangle.
And in fact, some of those structures that are created by executive order may well be embraced by Congress. Congress likes to get in on the act on something good, a positive arrangement for carrying out federal authority. And so
And sometimes they're just scared shitless and won't follow through. I mean, Epstein files. How many times has Mike Johnson, Moses Mike, uh, how many times has Mike Johnson called a recess on the House? Just in the last year.
Congress may, in effect, ratify what the president has created by executive order and make it permanent by statute and sometimes give that structure a budget. So there are some good examples of this.
Yeah, we see how well that worked with the Epstein Transparency Act, huh?
For example, the Office of Management and Budget itself originally was created within the president's team of senior advisors at the White House. And the president cannot carry out his executive functions on his own. He needs a team of senior advisors and assistants. Congress doesn't direct what those advisors and assistants do. Their duties are defined by the president. Congress gives the White House a budget so the president can be assured of having those advisors and assistants in office around him.
And that's how we wound up with an ICE enforcement group with a military budget, or a budget rather. Essentially, it's a military budget, but a budget bigger than the United States Marine Corps.
But Congress does not set out by statute what their specific duties are. The president can do that by an order and an executive order, for example. And so by executive order, the president originally created the Office of Budget within the White House to do budget analysis and assist the president in creating a proposed budget to present to Congress. Well, Congress liked this idea and didn't want it to remain simply a function within the White House that was not subject to more public transparency, for example. And so Congress institutionalized that office by statute. We now have the Office of Management and Budget, which is an agency within the executive office of the president surrounding the White House. So sort of the next ring out from the president, but it's an agency, and it has permanence, and it has functions, and it has a head who is now confirmed by the Senate, nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate.
Mm-hmm. Mm. And when you have a spineless Congress, when you have a spineless Senate, or yeah, like they don't listen to their constituents, then you get what we've got today.
It is subject to the Administrative Procedure Act. It is subject to to the Federal Records Act and to FOIA, for example, Freedom of Information Act. Those statutes that apply to agencies that do not apply to the president and the White House. Another example is.
So yeah, they're trying to make it sound like the president has limitless power. They're trying to paint it like the president is a dictator because that's what they want. But we can't let them have it, can we? So what are you going to do to help me stop them?
Is the structure for cost-benefit analysis of major rulemakings within the executive branch. An idea originally created by executive order by President Reagan and then revised by President Clinton, and it carries on. This is the cost-benefit analysis that agency rules go through. A common analysis carried out by OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within OMB. And that's pursuant to Executive Order 12866, famous executive order. It's been revised multiple times. Unfortunately, the current president is proposing to make very significant changes in that process, which are really going to negatively impact the cost-benefit analysis, and that would be something that a new conservative administration would certainly want to revisit. But
Okay, I'm going to have to go back and revisit that detail because I don't trust anything these guys say.
Congress has recognized the importance and utility of that cost-benefit analysis and has referred to that Executive Order 12866 multiple times through statute. They created the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within OMB, which has a Senate-confirmed head. And so, again, by essentially statutory ratification, Congress has blessed that structure, which was created by Executive Order. Another example of
Hmm. Sounds like they're dreaming up recipes for getting things set in stone their way. Uh, that would require some really hard work to untangle from the federal level.
this is what's called CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, originally created by President Ford by executive order. And what this committee is, again, presidents cannot create new agencies or new legal authorities. The president tasked heads of major departments with getting together in a committee and reviewing the extent to which foreign governments, foreign powers, foreign entities were making investments into important businesses within the United States. And to
So he invokes Gerald Ford as an example to work from. All right, so let's talk about Gerald Ford for a brief moment. How did Gerald Ford become President Gerald Ford? Well, he became Vice President Gerald Ford after Vice President Spiro Agnew was forced out of office. Who was Vice President Spiro Agnew vice president for? Well, none other than President Richard Milhouse Nixon. You know, good old tricky dick. I'm not a crook. So then Gerald Ford became president by stepping into Nixon's vacated Oval Office because he had become vice president. And then who became Gerald Ford's VP? Somebody who was confirmed by Congress, an individual by the name of Nelson Rockefeller. What was one of Nelson Rockefeller's big claims to fame? When the United Nations was being formed, Nelson Rockefeller was key in negotiating a structure that allowed for the birth of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And that may sound vaguely familiar. You may have heard of them before. Pretty much America gave birth to NATO, and now Donny Boy wants to pull us out of it. And I don't blame our I guess technically now former NATO allies for stepping out on us. I mean, oh, good grief. What a sad state of affairs we live in.
to advise the president on whether those investments were creating national security risks or concerns that the president should address or should ask Congress to address. That was CFIUS, and he tasked the Secretary of the Treasury with the job of chairing the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Well, Congress, again, liked that idea, and more than a decade later, in 1988, Congress enacted an amendment to the Defense Production Act called the Exxon-Florio Amendment that recognized CFIUS and gave it specific authorities, including authorities to recommend to the president that investments in businesses in the U.S. by foreign entities that create national security risks could be blocked, and gave the president the authority to block those investments. I think the president.
Ah, oh God, that's so rich. How many foreign investments has Donald Trump himself taken personally? Like a $400 million jet from Qatar, just for starters. Just for starters.
President would say he already had that authority, but it was recognized by statute by Congress. And subsequent to that, in several iterations, Congress has amended and given further authorities and expanded the authorities and functions of CFIUS by statute. So that's just a good example of an entity, a structure that has permanence, enduring value for carrying out authorities within the executive branch that was originally created by executive order, and has been respected and continued to be carried out by every president since President Ford.
Again, Ford. Holy shit. All right, skipping
Other
forward.
types of presidential action. I want to stop and touch on some examples of other types of presidential action documents beyond executive orders, because there are multiple different types of instruments the president uses to give orders, directions, carry out his functions. A less formal version, more informal, is just simply a memorandum, a presidential memorandum. This does not have to be published in the Federal Register, although the president could ask that it be published. They will typically get posted, again, in that tab on the White House website for presidential actions. But a memorandum, presidential memorandum, can look a lot like an executive order, though it's less formal. The president will usually discuss policies, and will direct it, sometimes giving directions, requiring actions to be taken out by subordinates. Sometimes it's just for people within the White House. Other times it's for cabinet members and others across the executive branch. So it can look and feel, in certain respects, quite a bit like an executive order, but just less formal. There are also proclamations, presidential proclamations. Sometimes these are just ceremonial, like declaring a week should be set aside to honor X, Y, and Z, or proclaiming that the flags of the executive branch will be at half-mast, half-staff because of something that has happened. Proclamations can also be ways that the president exercises authority directly that he has that may be self-executing, that doesn't require subordinates to follow up with further actions, like proclaiming, making certain determinations of fact and proclaiming certain things to be established, like certain protected lands, for example, other actions like that, certain actions for purposes of foreign affairs.
So, Qatari Air Base in Idaho and homeless concentration camps on national forest land. Check. Gotcha.
The president may also make declarations. Typically, these are pursuant to a statute that gives the president authority to declare, for example, an emergency if he makes certain facts, determines that certain facts are in place. And that is simply a declaration pursuant to that statute. And certain things will follow then from that declaration. There are also
They're eating the cats. They're eating the dogs. Seriously?
national security versions of executive orders. These typically will not get published in the Federal Register. Some of them may well be classified and not available publicly or broadly. These can take the form, for example, of a national security presidential directive, which looks a lot like an executive order, but addresses a national security concern. And that usually gets managed. The process for developing the NSPD will get administered by the National Security Advisor's office rather than the OMB director, though the
So that job got shifted over in modern context to Tulsi Gabbard. Oh my goodness.
OMB director may also review and be involved. There are also presidential policy directives, which usually also address foreign affairs or national security matters. There are then military
Marco Rubio.
orders. The president can give orders to the military to carry out that may have a different form and again get reviewed and circulated and approved through different channels.
Oh, is that how we got all those military commanders telling their soldiers they're going off to Armageddon?
The most dramatic form of a military order is what's called an execute order, which is when the president actually signs off on a military action. So those would obviously usually be classified and may
Karg Island, Iran? Huh.
not become public for many years until many years have passed after the president has left office. So
Oh, you mean like when the paperwork leaked on Operation Northwoods, the whole setup to set for a false flag in Cuba to justify an invasion of Cuba back in the 60s? And JFK is like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. You guys done messed up at the Bay of Pigs. And then later we get the Gulf of Tonkin incident, that little psyop that kicked off the whole Vietnam thing because, domino theory. We wouldn't want Southeast Asia to fall to the commies. We'd be next. Just a continuation of the McCarthy era.
you just need to be aware that there's a field of different types of instruments the president uses, also just letters to Congress or less formal memos and things. Not all of these get posted on the White House website. Not all of them involve executive orders. Executive orders are just a subset. But there's overlap here. There's not a clear black and white delineation between when an executive order is used and when one of these other types of instruments may be used. And so it's just good to keep that in mind. The executive order is not always clearly defined as a distinct set of documents, though anything that is that does take the form of an executive order goes through that formal process I described, and gets published in the Federal Register.
Oh boy, howdy. Man, that's just some wild stuff right there.
Every president except one has issued executive orders in
Oh,
one form or another.
uh, yeah, wild stuff right there. I remember what I was going to say. Um, so what he was saying, doing there, low key, was nudge, nudge, wink, wink. You know what he really meant. Going back to what I was pointing out earlier, that what is presented to the public has been run through the ringer a few times, so that it's all nice and white, and crisp, and clean. And but meanwhile, other people have been privy to the initial intents of the document and can go, oh, okay, gotcha. And they can disseminate that to their people, especially given how, like, say, for example, ICE would have a liaison with the Trump administration, and then you've got appointees within there that are hearing what the real message is, what the initial intent is, and then disseminating that on out through the network. I can see that. I could so easily see these cats playing that out. That's the kind of shit they eat up. Pardon my language.
Every president except one has issued executive orders in one form or another. Um, they they're all numbered. Not all. There was a numbering for executive orders. The numbering system was created in 1907, and the first executive order, number one, was during the Lincoln administration. Don't ask me why they decided that would be number one and why they didn't start with George Washington. But George Washington did issue, in the form of a letter, something that we would describe now as an executive order. It was issued in the first days of his first administration, even before the Senate confirmed heads of the three departments were in place. He issued it to the temporary heads of those three departments. Those departments were State, War, and Treasury. And he simply asked them for their opinion on the state of the United States with regard to their areas of particular responsibility. And so he was asking his heads of his first departments to tell him what they thought was the state of the U.S. and what needed to be done so that he could potentially take action in the form of proposed legislation to Congress or what have you. So it
That sounds more to me like an executive request than an executive order. Hey, my friends, what you think about what's going on from your field of expertise? Not an order. Tell me about it. No, the way you followed that up, the way that descriptive, it was more like I need your input. I need to be able to make some decisions.
classic example of an executive order, and he issued that his first month in office in April of 1789. Also, of course, Abraham Lincoln issued documents that were called proclamations but were essentially executive orders, like the suspension of habeas corpus. Under the Constitution, it's really Congress that has authority to suspend habeas if there's an insurrection, for example. But President Lincoln took it upon himself to attempt to do that, or to do that, essentially declare martial law and set up military commissions during the Civil War in those areas that were under insurrection or were not complying with his orders and directions. And that was ratified by Congress later that year. They
Oh my God, they love telling that story. They do. They so love telling that story.
approved it by statute. President Lincoln also issued the Emancipation Proclamation. That was essentially a military order, but effectively a very famous executive order. Later, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, issued many, many, in fact, more executive orders than any other president, as you might expect, even more per year. He was very muscular in exercising presidential authority, and during World War II, during the Depression, etc. And of course, a very negative example of an executive order was the Japanese internment order. Ultimately, it was upheld during the war by the Supreme Court. Today, certainly would be struck down as unconstitutional, obviously affecting the private rights of Japanese citizens. That would be challenged and today struck down as unconstitutional.
Oh boy, that was like prophetic, wasn't it? I mean, um, how many courts have said that these immigrant concentration camps are unconstitutional? Huh.
President Truman issued important executive orders. He desegregated the armed forces through an executive order, exercising his authority as commander-in-chief and the executive officer for supervising and managing the ranks within the military services. So
Yeah, that's because that was a requested EO from the Department of Defense. They saw the issues of racial segregation. They could see it in civilian society. They could see it in the military ranks.
that was done by executive order. Famously, also during the Korean War, when there was a strike in the steel mills, President Truman issued an executive order directing the Secretary of Commerce to take control of those steel mills and ensure that they would continue to produce steel as needed for the war effort. Now, that executive order was challenged in court. It went up to the Supreme Court, and that's an example of a ruling from a court, the Supreme Court ultimately, that declared that the president did not have authority to direct the Secretary of Commerce to take those actions.
And that's why we have so many lobby groups that are backed by billionaires who can leverage their special interests.
Exceeded the president's constitutional authority, and he did not have any authority by statute to take that kind of action. You'll notice that that Supreme Court decision was Youngstown Steel and Tube versus Sawyer. It was not versus Truman. Sawyer, Charles Sawyer, was the Secretary of Commerce. So it was directed at the Commerce Secretary, who was actually carrying out the orders of President Truman to seize the steel mills.
And that's why I'm guessing that presidents choose expendable cabinet members.
And so this is consistent with the idea that when agencies act or agency heads take action, that action under the Administrative Procedure Act or other rules and traditions is subject to, often subject to direct review in courts and challenge in courts, particularly if it's affecting somebody's private rights and they have standing to sue in court and challenge that. And that's what happened with the steel seizure executive order. Some contemporary examples. For example, during the Trump administration, President Trump made frequent use of his ability to issue executive orders to carry out his authority. And so, for example, he issued orders that effectuated his policies to pursue regulatory reform. So you may have heard of the executive orders that required that we cancel 2 regulatory restrictions for every new major regulation we put in effect. And he directed every department and agency to carry out that 2-for-1 policy.
And that's how you get the slow creep of deregulation. That's how you wind up with how we wound up with the train derailment, the Norfolk Southern train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, a few years back when J.D. Vance was still a member of Congress. Governor DeWine, Republican, there was no need to detonate those cars. And had the Trump administration not just months prior signed an executive order which allowed the Norfolk Southern to stop inspecting the brakes on trains, maybe that derailment wouldn't have happened. Just saying.
Also, he required each regulatory agency, like the Department of Transportation, where I served, to come up with a regulatory cost budget, which would be approved by OMB.
Oh, Department of Transportation, East Palestine, Ohio. Oh, good grief.
These are efforts to ensure that all of the departments and agencies across the executive branch are coordinated and pursuing a common goal of minimizing regulatory costs, ensuring that regulations that are issued are really necessary and have been reviewed and coordinated across the executive branch and do not create any unreasonable or undue burden on the economy. This deregulatory
No. He's not talking about the economy. He's talking about the billionaire money.
effort was a huge part of what led to economic boom times during the Trump administration. The other major element of that being tax cuts. But regulatory reform and the deregulation emphasis was huge. That was done through executive orders from the president and then carried out and implemented in the regulatory and rulemaking actions of all the departments and agencies. Each of those rulemaking actions could be subject to challenge in court, And through those challenges sometimes, and actually there was an effort to challenge directly in court the president's executive orders, this idea of the 2-for-1 and the regulatory cost budget was upheld because agencies still have to carry out their rulemaking authorities consistent with their own statutes. And as long as they're doing that, they can act consistently with the president's directions in.
So you do that by making sure that you cut regulations that you don't want in there to make room for the regulation that's inbound. All right. So besides brake inspections on railway trains, uh, what else was cut in exchange for what?
Overarching executive orders like that. The president also used by executive order the Defense Production Act during the COVID pandemic to direct the Secretary of Agriculture to ensure that there was an adequate supply of meat and poultry for the country. You may remember that meat and poultry processing plants were closing down because of the pandemic.
And they never leaned into the national emergency food stores. Yeah, check into the story about the cave full of cheese.
And so the president, using the Defense Production Act, directed the Secretary of Agriculture to ensure there would be priorities for government contracts for meat and poultry processing plants to stay open. That was done by executive order. Similarly, the president closed the borders because of the COVID pandemic and the concern that people infected with COVID could be coming over the borders into the U.S. And that was in the form of a proclamation, but looked a lot like an executive order with directions given to the Secretary of Homeland Security, for example. Now,
With directions for the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Oh, good grief! I don't even remember now off the top of my head who that was at that point.
President Biden has made even more robust use of executive orders, probably than President Trump. He's certainly on track to do that. Issued 48 in the first 100 days, again, using them as mouthpieces, as
Oh my God, the projection these people do. It's as incessant as their hypocrisy.
soapboxes, if you will, for PR purposes, but also really to put in motion in a very coordinated way a lot of his policy emphasis on climate change, on DEI, on environmental justice, racial equity. These are the policy priorities for the Biden administration, and you see those in his executive orders. And then he's directing his agency and department heads to carry out those policies, and they are doing it, I'm telling you, in a very active way. It's very
Oh my goodness, the fear mongering, and the training video.
very regimented and organized across the executive branch to try to implement through guidance documents, rulemaking actions, departmental orders down within the layers of the executive branch, all of these Biden administration policies and goals. So the next conservative administration will have a big job to take a careful look at all of those and unwind a lot of those policies that are not consistent with a conservative approach to governing. That will be a huge job. That's
Good grief, yeah, and untangling everything that they've done is going to be a huge job.
one of the main reasons why Project 2025 is focusing so much in our Pillar 4 on creating detailed playbooks and plans for departments and agencies to implement the conservative policies that are set out in our Pillar 1 policy book, and the directives that the new conservative president, we can hope in 2025, will issue in the form of executive orders. So there's going to be a great amount of work for a new administration to do in this area. It's very important to understand what executive orders are, what they can do, what they cannot do, how they're used, and how they can be revoked, how everything that follows from them can be taken a second look at and unwound if necessary. So I invite you to consider how you might help in advancing the preparations and planning for that kind of effort, and potentially how you might serve in a new conservative administration to carry out those policies. And understanding how executive orders work can be an important part of that. So I hope this has been helpful in that regard, and thank you for your attention.
Good grief. Oh man. So yeah, um, I knew they had a detailed plan, and I've heard all this stuff before because of the fact that I was MAGA and I was a live streamer over there. I I didn't go as deep as some did. I did not wind up in Q, although I was Q adjacent. I did a lot of work with a lot of Q followers, and I got invited into Kekistan. Uh, they tried to recruit me, and that's the most radical of the radical. Anybody who's checked into 4chan and Kekistan has some inkling of how dark it can get over there. It's a death cult, man. It's a death cult, I tell you. I know. I used to be in it. Um, yeah. At this point, all I can do is with this part of the project is continue with presenting these with commentary, and then as we move forward and continue looking at some of these preachers I've been looking at, I'll be doing some politicians and stuff. I've got some lighthearted stuff on the slate as well. Uh, just because I can poke fun. It's actually really cathartic. But on a serious note, back to the issue at hand. Um, this Project 2025 nightmare. Um, Understanding the details of how this machine functions is going to be important because it's going to come in handy as we move forward in the future, not just to untangle this, but to also challenge Project Esther and the America First Policy Foundation, I think is what it's called, as well as this new Project 2026 monstrosity that apparently is being cooked up to try to interfere with the midterms because these cats know they're losing. They're losing big time. Contrary to popular belief or the belief of some, there is an exit from MAGA. People are reaching their limits. Back in 2023, there was a video that Trump shared out that he was talking about putting homeless people in concentration camps. And then a few days ago, Brittany Page shared up a video that she made about Michael Savage, a guy that I used to listen to, and some other Trump supporter were promoting the idea of homeless concentration camps, and they're being built. And this is a waking nightmare. This is the waking nightmare, and I don't know that some people understand where we are, honestly, where we are as a country, what this is that we're dealing with. I I love protesting. Trust me, I love getting out there and hanging out with other people and making noise and seeing different costumes and different signs and seeing my fellow human beings take a stand against authoritarianism. It's going to take more than that. It's going to take positive action. And not everybody can throw in. Not everybody can throw down. Not everybody has the same risk reward scale that I have. All right. It's like Park Rose Permaculture stated one day. What is it you as an individual? What is it can you as an individual afford to risk to fight this machine? Is it going to be setting up chairs at a rally? Is it going to be organizing a protest? Is it going to be giving a speech at a protest or playing music at a protest? Or is it going to be actively engaging with people, trying to figure out ways to get through to them? Or are you like me and willing to put boots on the ground and willing to risk your very physical well being to go and protest at a TPUSA chapter meeting? There's two colleges here in town that have active chapters. I won't go do it by myself because I'm smarter than that. They, these people, they would love to get their hands on me. Me having been I was never TPUSA, but yeah, I was MAGA. I would not stand a chance out there by myself. And I get it. I get it. The fact that there's some liberals out there that don't trust me, but I've been out for 3 years. I've been fighting this machine for 3 years. And having come from the inside of it, I would hope that that my voice might get some traction. Yeah, sure, there's a lot of good people doing some great work out there. Tim Whitaker Speaks, or April of Joy, or Jenny Gage of Life Take Two, or Monty Mader, or the list goes on. There's just so many of us out here. We're all providing our own perspectives. It's just so happens that my perspective is from the political arm of the Assembly of God Church. I was raised to be a warrior for God with the intent of bolstering our government against those satanic communists. It's been a journey. I'm legit concerned about the future, but looking at the past and seeing the potentials that humanity has as a whole, when we join together on an empathetic cause, when we can recognize the change and growth in others and encourage it, for crying out loud, that helps provide a soft landing space for other people who might want to jump, that might want to leave. You can't you can't uh you can't project that people aren't going to be safe if they leave, if they're wanting to go. They need to be allowed to have their doubts. They need to be allowed to make their decisions. Sure, be suspicious of their activities until you can see that they have changed their efforts. Some folks, they aren't there on their journey. Other people like me, I I'm at a point now. I I find it difficult to to empathize with hurting people's feelings because I'm telling the truth. I try to do it as kindly as I can. But man, it's more than just Donald Trump. It's not. It's more than TPUSA. It's more than Nick Fuentes. It's more than Alex Jones. It's more than any one component. It's more than Scientology. It's more than Mormonism. It's it yeah, it's a lot. Anyway, so I've got plans to go meet up with some folks here in a bit, and I need the fellowship. Um, Community. That's what's going to get us through. Community, empathy, understanding. Trust comes hard. Trust comes real hard. Anyway, until the next video, please take care of yourself so you can help take care of each other. Get the rest that you need. Keep track of those fluids. For God's sake, please remember mental health matters.